what has gone before me and how our world has been shaped by our actions and by the actions of other people. Some helping others, some foisting tyranny on others. The notes which I have drawn together mark the beginning of a journey for me, understanding who and where I am. Not by dint of anything other than knowing how I feel and think about human actions, how we treat each other and how we are treated. At the front here, you can see a selection of books that I'm slowly gnawing my way through and turning them around, I suppose, like you would a sculpture or a diamond. Every time you look through it, it's different from all perspectives. I have to thank Virginia Blankenhorn, who gave a talk in the Ragged University, for helping me about the sources of knowledge. In particular, I'm drawing on the work of Professor Tom Devine, a fascinating scholar who has contributed a great deal to piecing together a fractured history of people. History, as he says, is a queen of all subjects. Herodotus, often cited as the grandfather of the subject, lived in the 5th century AD. Contemporary, we're told, with Socrates, somebody who didn't read or didn't write, apparently, but we know a lot of stories about him. This is history. He wrote the histories, which translated at the time as his inquiries. What I hope comes of my sharing this with you is not only that I learn something through teaching what I have gleaned, but I hope to fire something of an interest to further your own inquiries into the world we receive and remake. As well as this, I want an opportunity to voice this, my ongoing project of uncovering the histories, so you can add to it as you see fit. We learn together, and I learn through encountering what you carry, and also gain from being corrected in a friendly and constructive way. So at any opportunity, if you have anything to add to the picture, something which will enrich and hold and build upon the presentation, please come up here with me and add a couple of minutes by speaking up here with me. I think it would be quite nice. Michel Rolfe Trio wrote the book Silencing the Past, Power in the Production of History. In it, he talks about historiography. For those who are unfamiliar, historiography is the study of the methods of historians in developing history as an academic discipline. Part of Trio's thesis is in his book is that in the creation of every fact, there is a creation of a silence. It bears worth repeating. In the creation of every fact, there is a creation of a silence. It is these silences that we are particularly interested in today. He goes on to make the point that effective silencing does not require a conspiracy, not even a political consensus. Its roots are structural. Silences enter the process of historical production at 4 crucial moments. The moment of fact creation, the making of sources, the moment of fact assembly, the making of archives, the moment of fact retrieval, the making of narratives, the moment of retrospective significance, the making of history in the final instance. I want to highlight this, but what you're going to hear tonight is not the important thing. What is important is the skills for you to deconstruct, to research, and construct your own inquiry. Otherwise, we can end up slaves to regimes of truth, which silence important voices, stories, songs, and histories which would otherwise enrich and broaden our world. Harold Innes, teacher of Marshall McLuhan, wrote about the concept of monopolies of knowledge. He was an economic historian and a teacher of communications theory. And this is a quote from Harold Innes. What is monopolized is the control over the structuring of space and time. The ruling group, organized institutionally and backed by a particular type of communications technology, for example, parchment, maintains its power by formulating a particular conception of time. It is a monopoly because the intricate rationalization of this conception are mastered and actively discussed by a relatively small group. So I'm interested in knowledge production in all of our lives, in a diffuse sense, in the relationships that we have, in the things that we are witnessing in our times. I love the expression, wisdom is carried in the people. Can't find it in a book. We can only find it in dialogue with the world around us. Knowledge is power, but only when it is shared. Something told to me by Francis Benton, formerly a fundraiser for Bernardo's charity. So in this instance, we're talking about power over space and time. A beautiful thought, don't you think? A liberty we can find in each other. Andy Whiteman has written a book called The Poor Had No Lawyers, Who Owned Scotland and How They Got It. I'm going to draw upon it now. I want to convey how the theft of Scotland's commons has robbed us not only of extensive communal interests in land, but of a sense of connection with place, which is leading to all sorts of social and economic problems. In recent years, one of my colleagues in these matters, Alistair McIntosh, has been working assiduously on this question to show that soil and soul are vital ingredients in recovering a sense of identity and belonging. So, at this point, I'll step aside and we'll take a few moments just to absorb some of the pictures that are up here. These are going to be cycling through the talk. And I grew up without a knowledge of history. I was born in Scotland. Apparently I'm Scottish. I didn't know where I was from, who I was from, what happened before me. My friend Will, who speaks Gaelic and 6 other languages, calls me déraciné, uprooted. I never realised walking through the Highlands or the Lowlands that what's missing. What's missing? Well, these are deforested lands, and these are denuded of people, townships, crofts, families, livings. These were homes. These were places where people tilled the land and made their sustenance. A lot of these never meant anything to me. They were just, here's another rock in the field. Oh, there's some more lichen. A lot of the dry stone dikes that you see are constructed from the crofts and the buildings that were taken apart when people were forced from the land through either soft or hard tactics. We will benefit greatly from remembering that the struggle over land is a universal one that knows no geographic boundaries. We are all creatures who require shelter and nourishment, and that comes from having a place to call home. In 1909, Tom Johnston, later to become Secretary of State for Scotland and one of Scotland's finest historians, wrote, "Show the people that our old nobility is not noble, that its lands are stolen lands, stolen either by force or fraud. Show people that the title deeds are rapine, murder, massacre, cheating, or court harlotry. Dissolve the halo of divinity that surrounds the hereditary title. Let the people clearly understand that our present House of Lords is composed largely of descendants of successful pirates and rogues. Do these things and you shatter the romance that keeps the nation numb and spellbound, while privilege picks its pockets. A democracy ignorant of the past is not qualified either to analyse the present or to shape the future. And so, in the interests of the high priests of politics and the lordly money changers of society, great care has been taken to offer us stories of useless pageantry, chronicles of the birth and death of kings, annals of court intrigue and international war, while withheld from us were the real facts and narrative of the moment. The loss of our ancient freedom, the rape of our common lands, and the shameless and dastardly methods by which a few selected stocks snatched the patrimony of the people. Land rights, which appear legitimate and almost sacred today, in fact, are the product of a long and none too wholesome history. As we've moved on a bit since then, the fact is that landowners today are the beneficiaries of the nefarious deeds of their ancestors, thanks to the legitimacy afforded by a land law system that their ancestors themselves constructed. Andy Whiteman argues that there were 5 main land grabs in Scotland, naming them feudalisation, the appropriation of church property, legal reforms in the 17th century, the division of commonties, and the nepotistic alienation of the common good wealth of the boroughs of Scotland. He argues the case that the way in which law and economy around land have been structured is to benefit the haves at the expense of the have-nots. To give you an idea of the current ownership of Scotland, if we look at the total area of 19,469,433 acres, so let's call it 19 million, 258 privately owned estates cover 6.669 million acres. So, of a population of 5,295,000, according to the 2011 statistics, it effectively means that 0.0049% of the population owns over 34% of Scotland's land. So, the backdrop. I'll start out with a quote from George Orwell, reprinted from his column, As I Please, in the Tribune, 18th of August, 1944. Stop to consider how the so-called owners of the land got hold of it. They simply seized it by force, afterwards hiring lawyers to provide them with title deeds. In the case of the enclosure of common lands, which was going on from 1600 to 1850, the land grabbers did not even have the excuse of being foreign conquerors. They were quite frankly taking the heritage of their own countrymen, upon no sort of pretext except that they had the power to do so. So I start this story by hinting on the rise of the histories of the enclosure south of the border, by making you aware of the history of Gerard Winstanley. Is anybody familiar with Gerard Winstanley? Well, this guy was born 19th of October, 1609, baptized in the parish of Wigan. I always liked links, and thought, well, George Orwell's Road to Wigan Pier takes us nicely from there. So he was born in the West Derby of Lancashire, and we're going to be visiting Lancashire later on because the peoples of an island's history are linked inextricably. He was an English Protestant religious reformer, political philosopher and activist during the protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. Winstanley was one of the founders of the English group known as the True Levellers, or diggers for their beliefs and for their actions. The group occupied public land that had then been privatized by enclosures and dug them over, pulling down hedges and filling in ditches to plant crops. True Levellers was the name they used to describe themselves, whereas the term diggers was coined by contemporaries. So I'm always trying to bring these histories to life in my mind. At one point, if I was born then, I would be going and I'd be making my food from common land, and the likelihood is Most of us would be going down to the common land, maybe taking a hare, maybe digging up some root veg, grinding down oat acorns for flour. We'd be drawing upon these spaces to live. And there would be a certain kind of etiquette that we'd develop and negotiate and renegotiate over time. John Locke wrote interestingly about the commons, and two provisos he spoke about, the proviso of wastage and sufficiency. I'm allowed to take from the commons, say it's a loch with plenty of fish. And we're all going to the loch, and we all want a bit of fish for supper. Now I can take on proviso that what I take from that loch, I don't waste. And what I take, when I take from that loch, I leave sufficient for all of you. So this is how I'm building pictures in my head. At a certain point, the Enclosures Act, I think, don't quote me on it, meant that people who had more muscle grouped together and put walls, hedges, and went, everything inside here is mine. You're no longer allowed to take a hair off this land. You're no longer allowed to take brambles off the bushes. But you can come and work for me if you want. And that's the simplistic version of it. So, the Wars of the Covenant had taken place during the 1630s and the 1640s, which were then followed in the 1650s by the annexation of Scotland by Oliver Cromwell. After this period, there was a great stability for people to build. In the Highlands, full-scale clan warfare had become a thing of the past, and most unrest was confined to banditry and petty lawlessness. Some landowners were showing greater interest in raising the revenue of their estates. The church convened on civil matters and kirk sessions where ministers and elected elders act as a local moral tribunal, supervising the conduct of parishioners and punishing them according to a Christian code they had. In the 1680s, there was an intellectual flowering with Stair in law, Bruce in architecture, and Sibbald in medicine. In this era of rampant economic nationalism, according to Professor Devine, when the leading states tried to gain advantage at the expense of their trade rivals through the aggressive use of prohibitive tariffs. So international trading was being protected by heavy taxation, and this kind of protectionism, I dare say, stimulated moral philosophers to start thinking about how people were working in the economy together. A moral philosopher you might know the name of is Adam Smith. Scotland would be hit badly by high customs barriers, but equally could not do much to retaliate. In the same period happened Scotland's ill-fated expedition to Darien in Central America. Is anybody familiar to the history of the Darien project? If you're not, it's what a calamity. So In 1695, there was national optimism. But by 1700, the attempt to found a Scottish colony in Panama to trade with the Pacific and Atlantic simultaneously had resulted in disaster. The failure had happened for many reasons, including poor planning to the devastating effects of tropical disease on the first settlers, which had not been encountered before. The Darien Project was something which had taken a vast amount of investment from Scotland and England, and English investment had been withdrawn from the original undertaking as a result of the mercantile and political pressures from London. The possibility of bringing relief to the Scottish settlement in 1699 had come to nothing, largely because London government refused to send provisions in view of maintaining Spanish support against France. So you've got a whole bunch of people from Scotland going over to Panama and setting up a colony. No experience of the temperatures, the terrain, no friendly connections there, I'm guessing. And people started dying, and disease hit them particularly badly. And I imagine it must have just been terrible, because no support from your roots, the communities where you originally came from. And these would have been people with pretty pioneering spirits, with trying to do something, well, in their minds that was very positive for the country. The Darien failure had a serious impact because of the enormous national investment that had gone into it, and the political fallout had been just as big. The costs hit the pockets of noblemen, laird, merchants represented in the Scottish Parliament, precisely at the time when many landowners were already suffering from a collapse of rental income as a result of the calamitous harvest failures in the 1690s. So I painted a very crude backdrop to what's going on in Scotland. Money's just suddenly fallen out the bottom of the purse. Living on the land. So Scotland was a rural-based society. The produce of the land, skins, grain, wool and coal were vital trading commodities and influenced much of the social interactions which took place. There was greater stakeholdership in the land, as people would have to generate what they needed to live, work, eat and socialize. Artisans, industrial workers and fishing communities would have a plot to independently cultivate food supplies. Between 1500 and 1600, the proportion of the nation's population living in the larger towns nearly doubled. And it did so again by 1700. The population was much more widely dispersed before 1700 than it was to become after industrialization in the 18th and 19th centuries, when mass migration was to alter the national demographic profile decisively in favour of the central lowlands and the cities of Glasgow and Edinburgh in their booming satellite towns. So I picture a patchwork of people, fairly diffuse across the land, you know, from the centre of the Scottish land all the way to the coasts. And we'd be making our food and being largely self-sufficient, but there was networks of markets running between communities and overseas. You've got a rich intellectual connection and cultural connection between the Scots and the European continent. Scotland, in the later 17th century, had an estimated population of little more than 1 million inhabitants. This was about 1/5 of the population of England, and only 1/8 of that of Spain. Much of Scotland was dominated by mountain and moorland, and habitation therefore tended to concentrate on more favoured areas where intensive arable farming could take place. Even in the later 20th century, after nearly 300 years of improvement in drainage, around 2/3 of the country is still suitable only for rough grazing. One estimate suggests that in 1700, only 5.3% of the population lived in towns with over 10,000 inhabitants, a long way behind more urbanized societies like found in places like England, the Netherlands, Belgium. Edinburgh was the biggest town with a population of 30,000 by the early 18th century. Aberdeen and Dundee had about 10,000 inhabitants each, while Glasgow had emerged as a second borough in the land by the late 17th century, with a population reckoned at 15,000 and growing. There was generally massive levels of emigration to Europe and Ulster during the 17th century. The links with continental Europe were strong, and we can see this influence both in the legal system and in the system of education which prevailed. Scots travelled as soldiers and traders from early medieval times, far and wide. In the second half of the 17th century, emigration levels reached between 78,000 and 127,000. So a note on the legal and educational system. These were both based on the continental systems. The educational system had philosophy at its centre, and you would create arguments and bind subjects together. If you could argue your case, it was an educational merit. A good book on that is The Democratic Intellect. The legal system also drew from the continental system, which was not case law or common law, which we find in England, but I believe that it's more based upon being able to argue a particular line of reasoning according to principles which are laid out. But I will get back to this story. Most tasks, both in agriculture and industry, continued to be done by hand. Even in cotton, the most advanced manufacturing sector of all, 2 of the 3 core processes, weaving and finishing, remained mainly labour-intensive until the 1820s. The cost of labour was therefore an absolutely crucial factor in Scottish industrialisation. Undeniably, wages in certain trades were rising in the later 18th century. For instance, agricultural workers experienced a substantial growth in real income in the central lowlands, averaging between 40 and 50% between 1750 and 1790. Nevertheless, most Scottish wages remained below those of England, and it was partly because of this attraction that English tycoons like Richard Arkwright boasted that the lower costs of production in Scotland would enable him to take a razor to the throat of Lancashire. So we've got that connection down where industry had taken root, the mills had risen around Lancashire and Manchester areas, and people had started to get a sense of their own worth and were getting very well paid. And I suppose this is something that we see today, where industry, corporacy particularly, will go to cultures and places that are in desperate need of resources and exploit that for low wage. I believe to this day, on the African continent, they're not allowed to add value to their raw goods. So they can dig copper out of the ground, but they can't turn that copper into wire and increase its value. So there's these invisible trade embargoes around the African continent. Sorry? And they can't sell it on the stock market directly as well. So exploitation, although a century later, in the 1860s, when the first rigorous wage censuses became available, Scotland was still unequivocally a low-wage economy in most occupations compared to England. Historically, the Scots were a migratory people. But in the 18th century, internal migration became more common precisely at the time when industry needed to attract more workers. Seasonal movement for harvest work from southern and central Highlands for work in the Lowlands harvests was significant after 1750. In the same region, the first clearances for sheep, the transfer of people from the inland straths to the coastlands as the new crofting system was established, and the social strains coming from rampant commercialization all led to a more internal migration, as well as promoting a large-scale exodus of people across the Atlantic after 1760. So you've got people being moved from the inland to the coasts. A lot of the inland land was very good for arable farming, and people were being pressured to leave the land and take up other professions. And a lot of this destabilized the population. They had to go where the work was to feed themselves, to feed their families, because they didn't have as much access to the land to make the sustenance they needed. In the Lowlands, agriculture improvement was radically altering the traditional social order, and in the process, dramatically cutting back the large numbers who had always had legal or customary right to land. The tenant class contracted further, and cotter families with small holdings possessing skills in spinning and weaving were steadily replaced by landless servants and labourers. Lowland Scotland certainly had a larger number of people detached from land holdings by 1800 than ever before, and the resulting rates of short-distance migration were truly remarkable. Scottish internal mobility was a decided bonus for manufacturers keen to hire more labour. The mills crystallised the conflict between the culture of work in the old order and the new. E.P. Thompson showed that the traditional pattern was one of the alternative bouts of intense labour and idleness. Full-time work, though not unknown, was unusual outside the towns, and the majority of people had little interest in labouring for longer than their basic needs required. In Lowland Aberdeenshire and Renfrewshire, around half the possessions were under 30 acres, and even in the more advanced country of Midlothian, over a third fell under this category. The majority of families like this have devoted their energies above all to subsistence husbandry in order to pay the rent and feed their families. Selling in the market was decidedly secondary consideration. So what we were making, if you imagine yourselves there, was mostly the necessity to live. Any surplus would start being taken to do barter in exchange. We'd truck and barter. The tenant class was steadily contracting in size, with thrusting individuals bettering themselves at the expense of others by absorbing individuals bettering themselves at the expense of others by absorbing more land in the townships. The significant illustration of this trend was the expansion of holdings held by one tenant and a fall in the number of farms possessed by several husbandmen. So there was a more cooperative way of working the land, and this started to give way to individuals holding land and then hiring others. The enlarged single tenancy was geared more to serving markets and less constrained by communal working practices. The farm under one master was to become the ideal of improvers later in the 18th century. A wide sample of holdings in 5 lowland counties carried out by Professor Devine suggests that more than half the farms were still in multiple tenancy at the time of the Union. However, in the next few decades, this form of tenure was seen to be in rapid decline. And thinking about this in terms of housing stock and what we're seeing in the UK just now, we saw this land grab for the sale of social housing, and I saw lots of private companies move in and start buying up all this private housing stock, all this public housing stock as assets. And now we're in a place where people there's not enough social housing in the UK. And, trying to think how history repeats itself. Indeed, in most of the estates examined, by the 1740s, single tenancy was overwhelmingly dominant, with only around 1/5 of all holdings now containing 2 or more possessors. Even within the old world, therefore, an embryonic rural middle class was emerging in some areas. The impact of the new tenantry was nowhere more apparent than in the borders, where great sheep ranches with large areas of hill grazing and limited arable holdings in the valleys were well established in the eastern borders by the late 17th century. One result of this territorial expansion was the unrelenting squeezing out of the rural population. Abandoned tombs, which were inhabited into the early 18th century, could be found throughout the Tweed Valley and Eskdale. Similarly, a number of parish entries for this region in the statistical account of the 1790s describe once populated settlements which were now visible only as mouldering remains. Over 100 years before the Highland clearances, the advance of commercialised sheep farms in the deep south of Scotland was causing widespread depopulation. We had got up to the point where plots of land which used to be much more communally worked and shared had started to become owned predominantly by individual tenants who were hiring people, and a lot of people had been destabilized. So you got this migratory pattern of people going where the work was so that they could have enough sustenance and survive in the culture that had fewer and fewer options, where traditionally we could have made our own vegetables and raised a cow between a small bale. I think that's how it's pronounced. Yeah, a small tune. Sorry? A bale share. Right. Bale share. Yeah. Fewer and fewer people had access to using the land, were allowed that tenancy and that tenure. In the western borders, Sir David Dunbar at Baldoon, near Wigtown, built a great cattle park over 2.5 miles long, and 1.5 in breadth to winter over 1,000 beasts. Dunbar was only one of several borders proprietors who let their estates to commercially minded tenants for specialist stock rearing. This process reached its climax in the 1720s, when several lairds accelerated the process by clearing out small tenants and enlarging the stock farms held by rich possessors. The arable lands were laid down to grass, and the tunes, now cleared of their inhabitants, were enclosed by dykes, with the aims of taking further advantage of favourable cattle prices in England after the Union. This strategy provoked open rebellion from the people. A rising of several hundred armed men in the summer of 1724 broke down the dykes, killed and mutilated cattle, and then confronted a military force of 6 troops of dragoons, hurriedly sent in by a worried government. Nocturnal attacks went on for over 6 months until the turmoil subsided. This, the so-called Levellers' Revolt, was the most serious rural disturbance in the 18th century Scotland. It was a telling reminder how, in the southwest in the 1720s, the conflict between the traditional ways and the market pressures, poor tenants and farmers with an eye for commercial opportunity, was already a reality before the more fundamental changes coming in after 1760. Much more numerous than the tenants in most of the farm settlements of the period were the cotter families. A cotter in Scotland and Ireland was a farm labourer or tenant occupying a cottage in return for labour. Cotters held a few acres, usually less than 5, from tenants in return for providing labour services for a number of days in the year, and occasionally also making some rent payments. A tenant ploughed their small holding and allowed them to keep a cow. Tradesmen such as weavers, carpenters, blacksmiths and other artisans were also cottars, with tiny plots of land and a house within the firm tomb. There was an extraordinary numerical prevalence of the cotter throughout the length and breadth of Lowland Scotland. Cotter families formed the reserve army of labour in an agricultural system in which peaks of work were concentrated in only a few periods of the year, at times of ploughing, harvesting, and the gathering of peat. They were a guaranteed workforce at the busy times, but could easily be laid off in slacker periods. Enclosures were few. The land was open, and much labour had to be employed in herding. Peat gathering demanded a huge effort from the local community through the summer months. Ploughing with the old Scots plough could involve a few oxen, horses, and several men. It was useful for tenants, especially as their holdings increased in size, to have many hands to assist in the neighbourhood. As the technological revolution shaped the towns and cities of Britain, with new processes, buildings and mills, increasingly people were living in concentrated masses in the cities. The Industrial Revolution was changing the landscape in terms of air and water quality, living conditions and opportunities, and profits. Massive profits, as also world trade increased. In less spectacular but equally important fashion, significant developments were seen in rural society. Commercial forces were now undeniably having a much greater impact, both in the Highlands and the Lowland countryside. The black cattle trade from the central and western Highlands was in boom, and by 1750s, exports of timber, slate and fish were significant. The country was stripped for its assets, and the land had offered up its forests and ecosystems as unwitting loot for cash profits. Thinking of renewal and preservation of important habitats and timber stocks was not a factor of the time, despite deforestation and the issues of these practices having been known about and noted since early Greek times by the Ionic cultures. So think about Greece. Greece was a big naval culture, and they cut down all the trees to make boats. And then they wrote about the devastation that wreaked on their traditional ways of living and surviving. The trees were gone. So when we're walking through the Highlands and the Lowlands, we've got to remember there are missing forests. Our country is denuded. And a friend, Paddy, looks up at the sheep and he calls them hill maggots, because that's what they represent for him. At the same time, there is evidence of changes in rental structure, where payments in kind were tending to become less common and were being steadily replaced by cash rents. On a number of estates, A radical change in tenure was underway as proprietors converted more and more smaller holdings into larger individual tenancies, which meant that the capitalist farming class of the agricultural revolution of later years was already emerging in embryonic form. So think super farms, where there were multiple small holdings, where there was much more cooperative work, where exchange of maybe, the goods that you're producing to pay in part for the land that you're living on, that was being displaced by people buying up land and turning into a middle class that took advantage of a destabilized mobile workforce. And the cash culture, finance had come to be the way that we dictated our exchanges. Promissory notes. I promise to pay the bearer on demand became the only route for some. No cash. I'm not, not going to play ball with you. And you may have plenty of mutton. You may have plenty of wool, carrots, and turnips, kelp. But I'm not going to see the value in this. I'm in the cash economy. And it's cash only. These are little paintings, if you like, I'm giving. Recent research has shown how active the Highland elites were in profit-making across the empire in the East and West Indies and the American colonies, and how much of this capital was channeling home to support ambitious schemes of improvement on family estates. And this is what they were calling improvement. Sheep, cattle, more profit. People, communities, are they as profitable? I can improve this land by changing the people for sheep. We know from a talk given by Kevin Williamson on the radical Robert Burns that he was working on Scottish-held sugar plantations as a bookkeeper, which helped him develop his sense of ethics and poetry. What money built the fine, fair buildings of Edinburgh and Glasgow's boom? Sugar, tobacco, slavery, and wool. These were some of the foundations of the Scottish elite, which don't get included in the modern fairy tales the nobility has spun on their shortbread tins. Various euphemisms were used, including that of improvement. Perhaps the most visible social effect of improvement was the removal of the cottars. In Lanarkshire, over a quarter of parishes reported in the statistical account of the 1790s described their extensive dispossessions. For Angus, the figure was 22%, and for Fife, around 1/3 of peoples. Witnesses were at pains to emphasize the radical and comprehensive nature of the removals, and this was shown in their colourful use of language. The minister of Kilmarnock in Fife referred to the annihilation of the little cottages. The report from Malarkey in Angus described how many of the cottagers are exterminated. Other observers noted the existence of numerous buildings in their parishes formerly inhabited by Cotter families, which were gradually falling into ruins. Elsewhere, Cotter dwellings were being systematically demolished and the stone used to construct dikes and walls in the new farms. All of this has a familiar ring, as these are the features usually associated with the notorious Highland clearances. Yet the social dislocation in the rural lowlands in the later 18th century has been virtually overlooked. And there's more and more being published about this now. It seems like the major difference of the dispossession was in the Highlands you got these sweeping annual cuts at people, whole people set adrift from the landscape. But in the Lowlands, you got people being dispossessed over generations. When tenure was up, they were cut loose, and that farm was consolidated into a bigger patch. And that bigger patch could hold more head of cattle, more head of sheep. It was no longer available for renewal of lease, if you like. A full-scale process of commercialization was underway, and one important indicator was the movement of rentals. Starting in the 1760s, but speeding up drastically during the Napoleonic Wars, rentals throughout the region soared to unprecedented levels. It was the speed and scale of rent inflation that was new and different from the early 18th century. And in addition, most of it reflected surging external demand rather than a return on landlord improvement investment. Sky rents trebled in the third quarter of the 18th century, while those of Torridon in Western Ross rose tenfold between 1774 and 1805. On Lachael Estate in Inverness, the rental jumped from £560 in 1760 to £863 in 1774, an increase of 54%, with even more dramatic rises later. Glengarry rentals stood at £732 in 1768, but by 1802 had spiraled by 472% to £4,184. And we hear this happening in London and all over the place. It's a pattern. The raising of rents to this extent demonstrated that the Highlands elites had now subordinated their lands to market production and new profit imperatives. The growing commercial economy of the decades before 1760 could be uneasily accommodated within the old social structure. But the traditional order was no longer compatible with wholehearted agricultural production for the market at competitive prices. The transition of clan chiefs to gentry to landed gentlemen, which had been underway for several generations, was finally achieved. Land came to be allocated through competition to those bidders able and willing to offer the highest return. There was a sustained and widespread assault on the traditional township or bale These group settlements of multiple tenant farmers, cottars and servants had formed the basic communities of Gaeldom from time immemorial. But over the space of 2 to 3 generations, starting in Argyll and Highland, Perthshire in 1760s, and quickly spreading north and west in subsequent decades, the Bale was broken up and virtually eliminated. The Bale, the Doon. By 1830s and 1840s, only a few remnants of a once universal pattern of settlement and cultivation remained. Thus, in much of Argyll, Highland, Perthshire, and the eastern parishes of Inverness, the lands were consolidated into single-tenant farms, some pastoral, but many arable, with their dependent servants and labourers. The community townships were steadily replaced by individual smallholdings or crofts with arable land dispossessed by single small tenants, and the grazing land still held in common. The core of the new structure was division of the scattered strips or rigs of arable, which were the basis of the old system of joint farming, into separate holdings of only a few acres. Throughout the whole Highland area, but especially before the 1850s, in the central and western mainland, commercial pastoral farms were advancing rapidly. The coming of the Ne Cered Mora, my pronunciation is gone. I'm uprooted from my language. Or big sheep posed a particular threat to the old society. Before the 1750s, there were few commercial specialist sheep ranches anywhere in the Highlands. Yet, as early as 1802, an official report of the Highland Society described how the hill country of Perth, Dumbarton and Argyll, and the entire west coast from Oban to Loch Broom were already under sheep. Most of Mull had been invaded, and the sheep frontier was also starting to advance in Skye. The report concluded ominously that in Ross and northwards, all parts capable of sheep soon will be occupied. As the delicate and graduated social hierarchies of the Bale are shattered and replaced by virtually uniform small tenancies of the new crofting townships, equally significantly, the traditional tacksman or gentry class was gradually reduced in number and social significance as deliberate destruction of the subtenure became a central theme of landlord policy from the 1770s. Sharp increases in rental also put acute pressure on many, as the 1750s, much of the rent of many Highland estates would be paid directly by the taxman. A century later, they were but a minor part of the social structure, and their decline was one of the clearest signs of the death knell of the old Gaelic society. The new middle class in many areas invariably comprised southern sheep farmers, cattle ranchers with little hereditary or ethnic connection with the people. The new landlord priorities and incessant market pressures produced a massive and relentless displacement of population. Eviction and forced removal became an integral part of the destruction of the traditional settlements throughout the Highlands. This This was the most direct violation of the Dúthchas. What is meant by the Gaelic as Dúthchas, and in Welsh as Sinathin, is impossible to accurately translate into English, but it expresses a sense of belonging to a certain area of land being rooted by ancient lineage to a particular place that was communally held by all the people of the clan. This idea of holding the land communally was never written down, as was the custom of the time. It was simply an idea that was accepted by all as being the natural order of things. The Dúthchas included an obligation on clan elites to provide protection and security of possession for their people within their lands. The tenant group, over the 50, 60 years of the improvement dynamic in Lowland Scotland, became smaller. It became an elite. The numbers with direct access through through tenancy dwarfed. They actually collapsed over that period. It became almost routine for estates in the northwest and the islands to move people from inland glens to the sea and to the areas of moorland where new crops were planted in the waste, and the settlers encouraged to reclaim it by potato cultivation. Removal of the Bailtoon, those who lived in the Bales, to create larger arable holdings was a significantly marked feature of the southern Highlands. This was a vivid illustration of the subordination of the human factor to the new needs of productive efficiency. Possession of individual areas of land had never been Possession of individual areas of land had never been permanent in the old society. When clan territory had been lost by conquest, annexation, and insolvency, it was common for subtenants and quoters, and even for principal tenants, to be moved from one farm to another. The later 18th century brought dispossession on a truly unprecedented scale over Gaeldon, with people in the move everywhere. Sometimes the pressures did not come by direct removal, the jacking up of rentals in a peasant economy in which the balance between the sufficiency and failure was a fine and precarious one, also caused immense strain. The detailed research by Marion McLean on Western Inverness-shire shows that often rent increases were pushed above the rise in cattle prices, and when the markets collapsed, rent arrears spiraled, and small tenants came under great pressure to surrender their small holdings. Similarly, when farms were offered for letting, higher rents reflected new commercial realities of the time. The poorer men had profound difficulty in competing with those who had cash. Loss of land was an inevitable result. Undoubtedly, it was large-scale pastoral husbandry that led to the greatest social dislocation. Extensive cattle ranching was increasingly practiced in parts of Argyll, Dumbarton, Perthshire, and dislodged many peasant communities. Much more significant was sheep farming. The new Blackface and Cheviot breeds were greedy for land and required different levels and types of land for different ages and sexes of the flocks. Cheviots, in particular, had special needs. Initially, they enabled sheep farmers to pay twice the rent, and that was usually possible on grazed lands by blackfaces, but they could not easily survive the Highland climate without access to low ground for wintering, and this posed a potent threat to the arable lands of the traditional townships. At the same time, the sheep competed for grazing with the small tenants' black cattle. Between 1780 and 1855, more than 50 acts of defiance against landlord authority occurred, and further intensive investigation will doubtless reveal even more instances of collective protest. Sometimes resistance took place on a considerable scale, as in 1792 in Easter Ross, when people of several districts came together and tried to drive hated sheep flocks that threatened their way of life out of the region. More often, opposition was highly localized, sporadic and uncoordinated, a spontaneous and desperate response to imminent eviction. I actually spoke to a guy who lives on Lewis, and he told me about how the place where he lives was a successful squat of land. They managed to squat it and fight these evictions, and recently they've bought back the land and it's owned by the community, as you find in a city. Women and men dressed as women were often to the fore. It's a bit Monty Python. Are there any men here? No. Sticks and stones were the usual weapons. The state factors, police and sheriff officers were assaulted and humiliated, but protest usually crumbled when the army became involved. The greatest single collective act of defiance of landlordism was probably the emergence of the Free Church in 1843, which drew many communities in the Western Highlands and Islands from the established Church of Scotland. This was the climax to a long series of patronage disputes, as the congregations in the Crofting region opposed the induction of unpopular ministers appointed by lay patrons, invariably landowners who did not share the evangelical commitments of the ordinary people. Evictions continued through various means, hard and soft, in times of famine and in times of plenty. By the time of 1848, the senior government relief officer during the crisis, Sir Edward Pine Coffin, it's my profession. Yeah, a career civil servant was so concerned about the sheer magnitude of the removals of peoples from lands that he wrote to his superiors, bitterly condemning landowners for seeking to bring about the extermination of the population, and that, in his view, it would lead to the unsettling of the very foundations of the social system. The whole process was enforced by a threat of the dread summons of removal. The factors on several estates came to resemble petty tyrants who ruled the people with an iron hand. One of the most notorious was John Campbell, the factor more, meaning big factor, Chamberlain of the Duke of Argyle's lands in Mull and Tiree. When he died in 1872, emigrant communities across the Atlantic celebrated in uninhibited style, as reported in the satirical poem Lament for the Factor More. When they heard in Canada that the beast had expired, Bonfires were lit and banners attached to branches. The people were cock-a-hoop with joy as they met one another, and they all got down on their knees and prayed God you had died. Part of the poem. Ding dong, the witch is dead. Another example of a cold-handed factor is the story of Patrick Seller. Born and lived in Helgen, he was a lawyer, as was his father, who was to become employed by Elizabeth Sutherland, the 19th Countess of Sutherland, and her husband, the second Marquess of Stafford, as their factor. They owned around 1.5 million acres, which formed the biggest private estate in Europe. To clear the people of land, tried dealing with overpopulation by raising the 93rd Regiment of Foot, the Sutherland Highlanders, which in August 1800 mustered in Strathnever before marching off to service in the Napoleonic Wars. War and death had been turned to as an answer by drawing on old clan allegiances. Between 1811 and 1821, some 15,000 people were cleared from the Sutherland estates, largely through the efforts of Patrick Seller. Seller later gave his account of what happened. Lord and Lady Stafford were pleased humanely to order the new arrangement of this country, that the interior should be possessed by Cheviot shepherds and the people brought down to the coast and placed in lots of less than 3 acres, sufficient for the maintenance of an industrious family, pinched enough to cause them to turn their attention to fishing. A most benevolent action to put these barbarous Highlanders into a position where they could better associate together, apply themselves to industry, educate their children, and advance in civilization. What a nice guy. This contrasts starkly with the eyewitness account of Seller's clearance of the Strathnever township of Rosal in 1814. The consternation and confusion were extreme. Little or no time was given for removal of persons or property. The people striving to remove the sick and the helpless before the fire could reach them. Next, struggling to save the most valuable of their effects, the cries of the women and the children, the roaring of the affrighted cattle, hunting at the same time by the yelling dogs of the shepherds amid the smoke and fire, altogether presented a scene that completely baffles description. It required to be seen to be believed. A dense cloud of smoke enveloped the whole country by day, and even extended far out to sea. At night, an awfully grand but terrific scene presented itself. All the houses in an extensive district that flames at once. I myself ascended a height about 11 o'clock in the evening, and counted 250 blazing houses, many of the owners of which I personally knew, but whose present condition, whether in or out of the flames, I could not tell. The conflagration lasted 6 days, till the whole of the dwellings were reduced to ashes or smoking ruins. On 13th June 1814, Seller was involved in the eviction of William Chisholm and his wife from their croft in Strathnaver. During the eviction, the roof was set on fire, with Chisholm's mother-in-law, Margaret Mackay, still inside. She was rescued by her daughter and taken to a nearby shed, where she died 5 days later. As a result, Patrick Seller was put on trial in Inverness in 1816, accused of arson and culpable homicide. He was acquitted at 1:15 a.m. on the morning of 24th April 1816. Clearly, Sellers' views of the rights of barbarous Highlanders was shared by the judicial establishment of the day. And I've drawn some from the website of undiscoveredscotland.co.uk. The courtroom at Inverness was densely crowded as the Lord Commissioner of Justiciary, Lord Pitnelly, addressed the prisoner at the bar. Mr. Seller, it is now my duty to dismiss you from the bar, and you have the satisfaction of thinking you are discharged by the unanimous opinion of the jury in the court. I am sure that, although your feelings must have been agitated, you cannot regret that this trial took place. I am hopeful it will have due effect in the minds of the country, which have been so much and so improperly agitated. The crimes of which Patrick Seller had been accused, he had been acquitted, were culpable homicide, real injury and oppression. The jury had taken a quarter of an hour to reach their unanimous verdict. 8 of them were local landed proprietors, 2 of them merchants, 2 of them tacksmen, and 1 of them a lawyer. Seller later became a sheep farmer and a tenant of the Sutherlands, making use of the part of the deserted landscape he had largely created. He died in Elgin in 1851 and is buried in the grounds of Elgin Cathedral. So that's where I hope. I'm sorry that it was so long, but I really was at pains to understand what to leave out. I recommend Tom Devine's work, and thank you very much for listening. It's just going up for 9. I don't know if anybody wants to ask any questions, or do you want to get a drink and some food and just chill out?
What caused the gentrification, the gentry from clan chiefs? If you had clan chiefs that were responsible for the clan, what gentrified them to?
From what I've read so far, right, I get the impression that it's the death of 1,000 cuts. Right, so initially you've got all this land, all this small holdings, and people were living and working the land much more communally. There was not a monopoly. And then the first shift was, we've got this new idea. Why don't you just buy up the land and then you can administrate the land with your cotters and, take the labor. And then later, the people who had that tenancy had the pinch put on them. All right, well, your ability to sublet the land is no longer, because the people up the feeding chain have said there's been changes in the law, or we're not allowing you to sublet, and so on and so forth until first they came, what's that famous quote? First they came for the Jews and I did nothing. Then they came for the homosexuals, then the unionists, and suddenly the clan chiefs had become enamored, caught in this glamour of finance. What happens when you reduce all the land and the stock to fewer and fewer players? Well, an oligopoly forms. And an oligopoly means that then they start fighting internally. And a bigger, right, I want to own you. The next person moves in. And so Adam Smith writes interestingly on monopoly. And the Corn Laws is a part of economic history where we can see how the holding of lands was reduced further and further to fewer and fewer people. And maybe people thought, I'm the clan chief, I will administrate this, I will look after people, and I'll just, trim off this piece of human rights here, and trim off this piece of human rights here, and we'll just live like a happy family.
It wasn't deliberate. It wasn't a conspiracy
I'm no expert. There's going to obviously be a multiplicity of motives from one person going, right, I can kick the legs out from these guys and I can exploit them to improve my position, to people going, well, life's awful different now, eh? There used to be social housing, but it's not like that anymore. Everything's private rents.
Which people that come behind when you're being up, that talk about moving away from the need to raise an army. And the context for that, to take it a little further, you would have to get on something. You couldn't just trample the people in order to. So in an ironic way, maybe you need peace to create better trading opportunities.
Yep.
End up in this hideous exploitation, where in the past you've got a kind of payback for buying, helping, whatever.
Yep.
Necessary because the warfare is taken away from the threat of market.
Yeah, the clan allegiances, the Duthkas, I'm not sure, where people were a lot more linked together. In fact, what was massively missing from everything that I've spoken about, pretty much most of the political backdrop.
The things and stuff on the red coats, did that will accelerate things, dividing the clans, or help to divide the clans, already divided anyway, but then imposing a rule from with Scotland.
No doubt.
And that had part to do with it.
I've got a friend who tells me about the tomb tabards, the empty coats, the puppet kings of Scotland. Yeah. And you're dividing the people and pitting the people against, one against the other. My weakness is that I'm massively deficient of these histories. You went through the modern process of education, you just get told, by the way, there was an industrial revolution in the First World War. All right, is that history? Yeah, don't worry about the rest of it. Oh, there was Culloden. What was Culloden about? Oh, all you need to know is lost.
Can you just speak up that point you've been raising and discussing? I was particularly interested in the connections. So if you had the original Highland chiefs with Dunedin, so that's a sort of vertical integration.
Yep.
The question is, what sort of social interaction and integration was there thereafter? And the ruling class, if we can call them that, who were they mixing with? Who were they affiliating with over this period? Because I'm not wondering what was reinforcing that behaviour versus the traditional vertical integration where you have the community based on time or whatever.
Yeah, I think these are things I'm mining away at these histories about. There's a book that I'm working out on In the Shadow of Adam Smith by Donald Rutherford, and that's a really good book on the development of political economy. And the political economy that underpins this is basically look where the money and power goes. And I can't hand on heart say that I understand anything much more than an allegorical understanding of what happens in these dynamics. I do know one book that I'm reading just now is called Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil, by Hannah Arendt. And she's talking about the Second World War, and in part of that, the Judenrat, how the Jewish councils organized the Jewish populations for Adolf Eichmann. There was a level of cooperation, which is a painful thing to acknowledge in history, because it's that's what
Clan chiefs were doing.
That's what the clan chiefs were doing, and there was complicity, and a lot. What did they? There must have been at some junctures offers where people were told, well, you either take the money and you get a high Higgins hat with us, or you've seen what happens to the rest of them. There must have been huge power differentials.
And also, I was just wondering, because as you're saying, I'm also aware I'm not historically very well informed, but the sort of question I'm also wondering about is how does this one in terms of the colonialism and the respect of the British Empire and so on, yes. Yes.
Yes.
Curious about different locations, the vibes of the experiences where they went. What it's even more experiences in Canada.
Well, you've got populations emigrating all over the world, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the Americas, and I suppose what happens when you're bundled on a ship, this is me talking from more imagination than fact. I've spent some time in Canada, and I understood that there's a tradition of I see it like mercenary work, Scottish getting involved in the military. So in Quebec, you've got the British legions taking Quebec, and when they seized Quebec, they had this French population, but only the Scots could speak French. So the Scots battalions looked after the French communities, and that is still remembered today. There's the old alliance. There's these deep historical, cultural, political histories at work. colonialization is colonialization.
Yeah, but I'm wondering in terms of the reinforcement of a certain way of behaving and the emergence of a certain social class, and then how that legitimizes the behavior, which, from a humanistic point of view, is unacceptable. Of course, it has terrible effects.
Absolutely. I've read papers and work on the license Raj, the Raj in India, where colonial influences, Britain went out, killed people, and took their stuff. And you went, right, okay, well, you're either working with us, or you're going to work with us, right? Well, you're going to help organize your people. And there's a certain amount of suggestion which shows that the caste system we hear about in India wasn't as rigid before the colonial influence. The colonization of India crystallized this, created a rigid social hierarchy of Brahmin at the top, you're the Hydrogens, you get to run the mills. And you at the bottom, we don't even talk to you. You just do stuff. So I at the danger of getting this wrong, I will recommend some of these books. I'm trying to stuff these worlds into my little brain and understand how behaviors have been influenced, how psychology has been influenced. There's that French joke: how do you create a queue in Britain? You hammer a post into the ground. There's a subservience which is interesting. I heard of a guy from the Hunter School of Entrepreneurship who runs a company, and he's trying to get people just to run with their ideas, and he says that there's a cultural thing at play in the UK. People look for the authority and are uncomfortable with innovating. But as an entrepreneur, he's going, right, here's the resources, just play, and I wonder whether that's to do with colonial impositions that run deep in our psyche. Am I meant to do this? Nobody said yes, so I won't do this. So I
And then the point about colonialism is interesting, because I also think, which is where something that is really interesting, because I think Scotland currently suffers from colonialism, and I think that many of the parallels of the less well-off in Scotland are paralleled with the indigenous people throughout the world, and there's drug abuses, the under-education, this early pregnancy, blah, blah, blah. And ghettoisation, of course. And the Labour Party and their housing policies, the council housing, I think, was the key to that, in fact, in yesteryear.
I empathise with that perspective. I walk along Princess Street and I see Topshop, and I think of a fat Philip Green sitting in Monaco, exploiting countries. And then he's part of an international class that's sitting in tax havens, giving nothing back to any country.
Well, they're doing that stuff over Britain then, because the position of the lowest place oppressed society. The English cities as well. Anyway, I was thinking about comparison with England further back, which is the Norman barons. That's kind of when hierarchical control of land starts there, and that this seems to be pushing the clan chiefs into an analogous position going into much later days. Like that, making Scotland catch up with England as regards that control ladder.
Well, I like the concept of simultaneity, holding that in our heads, that lots of things are on the go at all times. Good intentions, bad intentions, plans, taking overs, planned constructions. And that's why I started out with the idea that this is a world history. It's not a Scottish history. And also, I love this quote by Trio. This is a beautiful book. Wherever a fact is created, a silence is also created. And Michel Rolfe Trio. It's called Silencing the Past, Power in the Production of History. Yes. Effective silencing does not require a conspiracy, not even a political consensus. Its roots are structural. I think there's so much in this. This is not to say that conspiracies don't happen. They're very real. At one point, the French government assembled a whole bunch of people in the south of France to walk across France with shovels on their shoulder, going, we're going to dig up the gold. This was just to stimulate the economy. A very real conspiracy. When we've got corporations that are
artists.
What?
Con artists.
Con artists, yeah. Asset stripping every country, every culture in the world. Yep. Denigrating human rights. We've got to question these secrecy jurisdictions, as Richard Murphy calls them. These places where nobody pays any tax. And these companies sit and use all the infrastructure and exploitative working conditions. And I think it is related to these ancient pasts, where people just went, I can make a whackload more cash if I think about it like an equation rather than a community.
Whenever there's an election in this country, I have noticed that there's been almost a strike of capital prior to it to try and influence how people vote.
But the easiest to do it is with education, because people here vote for anything.
Yeah.
It's like they just so don't see the important things that's happening. It's like blaming all of us because, while it's fact that like Europeans actually contributed money to the budget, because we get kicked out if we don't work, everybody aimed up that we take away the money, and now they are getting the laws. I mean, I just read the paper yesterday. They want to take out the lawmaking from the parliament and just do the government. So basically, and people just like cattle, vote for it. So
it's
like what? 15 people will decide what's happening in the country.
Education is
And
being
people just vote
enclosed.
for it.
Where our non-physical stuff is now being enclosed. People are being demarcated out of livelihoods, professions. If you've not got a degree,
They vote for it. They don't fight against it. They go for it.
I mean,
Because they just don't see the real happening. Yeah.
it's interesting. I do believe in learning, talking, coming together and sharing, and also, calling a spade a spade. Like, let's walk along Princess Street and go, which one of these business entities is not tax dodging, is not culturally asset stripping everything, the marrow from, which is a net loss to the country, or which is a net bonus.
Whereby you can be sure that all of these enterprises is paying off the decision makers. That's why they don't pay tax.
There's a great book called the Great
Who are
Tax
supposed to
Robbery.
be representing you and the interest of the country.
Well, there's some interesting things.
Just going to come back to the point that we're making, that let's rid of lost in her book recently.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So she did a good piece on it last year, and it's interesting just because she was comparing Scotland to Norway, and also the European countries, and things are quite big ones, like Germany and France. But what was really quite frightening or a surprise for me was that in all of these other places, you had loads of decision makers, in a much more layered system of decision making, much more locally based. And in comparison to the UK, where we've ended up, creating larger and larger, triangles, really from local community to regionalism, then to local authority areas, and now you have just got a few people, as I said, you say,
We're always changing the boundaries.
yeah, and expanding them and having less accountability locally. And we think we've got an accountable government in Scotland. It's a million miles away from the accountability that we experience in Scandinavia in particular.
On the subject of land, could you tell us a little bit about a piece of land that's happening, that's being, you know more about
Oh, yes.
Andrew Carnegie?
Well, there's a little local bit of land at the back of Central Library. The planning application refers to it as India Building planning application, and the addressing on that planning application talks about the application as India Buildings, 11 to 15 Victoria Street and Cowgate Head Church, and it talks about it being 225,000 hotel development. So when people like me who live in this area from anywhere, about Nice and like that, and so I'm a leader, blah, 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 I have no idea, in fact, I don't think that you should be worried. I just think, no, God, I have to consider what this will be deal. And the big deal is that the 225 rooms are going to be in a new built hotel block, 6 to 11 stories high, just a couple of meters from the back windows of Central Library on land, that's been earmarked for the library's expansion needs, almost since the day it was built. They bought extra land in 1887 and got £50,000 from Carnegie. And the last area, but certainly the last area in Scotland, to adopt Public Libraries Act, allowing working class people free access to books, which of course Andrew Carnegie education, he saw as a basis of the research.
We're trying to steal the land.
Well, it's been sold off from under our noses. It's on land,
That's what I'm saying, we're trying to steal it.
Well, it has sold it. Yep. Quite a small amount of money relatively when you think about the asset that it is, and especially when it turns out that both the National Library of Scotland and central library are not universal access, which means that we don't allow wheelchair access. If you're on sticks, you have a great deal of difficulty moving around there. And I've met people who are turned away from those libraries because they're short-staffed that day, no one who might help them. Yeah? And actually, central library, it's impossible to use immediately if you are in a wheelchair. And on top of that, perhaps on fire estate, the books have been stored that don't comply with British Standard Archive methodologies. They've got internationally important collections that they are unable to display, because they've just been sort of like, kind of like not weak, they're just sort of slow erosion. Things have been done when they needed to be done. People have to be made aware of perhaps that America maybe even gathering together to fundraise for the extension. And yeah, it's kind of like just being sort of, stored away from under our noses. So yeah, if you want to kind of come and hear about it, there's a meeting at the Grassmarket Community Project on Wednesday at 7 o'clock. So there you go, you can hear a bit more about it, and hear a couple of people speaking about it. And that's in Cavalry Road. So, thank you very much.
So, and your website is?
Well, yeah, lettherebeLight.org.
Right. But if you send me the information, what I can do. Sorry?
You need to tweet about the meeting, didn't you, Ragged?
Yes, I tweeted about it.
Would you be able to provide circulars with
Absolutely.
So you go on to Alex's Twitter account, the Ragged University Twitter account. You don't need to, you don't have Twitter to see Twitter. So you can just.
Do you all visit the Ragged University website?
Yeah. Yes.
What I'll do is I'll put it on the front page.
Fantastic, thank you very much.
And make sure that you all, and I'll put it also on the calendar. And this goes for anything any of you guys want the world to know about. If it's free and anybody can take part in it, please let me know about it and let me help tell everybody what they can get involved in.
It's 7 o'clock. Yeah. Being a little bit earlier,
So where about this meeting?
this meeting is in Grassmarket Community Project.
Where's that?
86 Highland Road. Oh, so that is at the bottom of Highland Road. Isn't that what yeah, they have a sense of
Enjoy your meet up too.
So, thank you very much. Oh, yeah. If you see anything nice in terms of food, grab it.
You don't know it.
It's all the. Sorry for keeping you.
No.
Yeah, I didn't realize this myself, which is why I'm just sort of even into it. Well, Martin. I dropped in I took in some deers at Christmas, just to say hello. So that's about as